Russia's war economy is headed for disaster, and it's not just speculation, it's based on hard evidence. Despite what some may believe, Russia's resources are not endless, and their ability to sustain the war effort is crumbling. Today, we're going to break down exactly why Russia's wartime economy is unsustainable. We'll talk about the pressure points, where the cracks are forming, why inflation is skyrocketing, and how Russia is running out of options to maintain their military machine. Stay with me, because the evidence is compelling and the timeline is critical. Right now, Russia is financing their war largely from pre-war savings, which sounds clever at first, right? But here's the catch. When you spend more than you're earning, you eventually hit a wall. And that wall is fast approaching. Russia's economy is overheating, inflation is rising, and the Russian central bank has been desperately raising interest rates to keep things under control. Just recently, they hiked rates to 19%, which is unheard of in stable economies. Why? Because inflation is out of control, and that's where the real problems start to show. Let's break this down. There are two major drivers of inflation in Russia. First, the government is throwing enormous sums of money at defense spending, and second, there's a severe labor shortage because men are being sent to the front lines. Think about it. Russia is reportedly recruiting 30,000 new soldiers every month, pulling them directly out of the labor force. This creates a vicious cycle. Fewer workers are left to produce the very military equipment Russia needs, which means factories have to raise wages to stay competitive, further driving inflation. And that's not sustainable. The wage hikes don't just affect defense industries. This spills over into every other sector of the economy, pushing prices up everywhere. And while inflation is bad enough on its own, the situation gets worse when you look at how the Russian government is trying to deal with it. Their solution? They're hiking interest rates, as I mentioned earlier. In July, they went from 16% to 18%, and now it's at 19%. The idea is to make borrowing more expensive, which would theoretically cool down the economy. But here's where it gets messy. While the central bank is trying to slow things down, the government keeps pumping cash into military production. So they're basically working against each other. Raising interest rates is like hitting the brakes, while defense spending is like slamming the gas pedal. That's a recipe for economic whiplash. Now, if you're thinking, okay, but inflation isn't always a deal breaker, you'd be right, up to a point. Here's the thing. Inflation doesn't affect all products equally. Government-controlled items like military equipment don't see price hikes because they're bought at fixed rates. Tanks cost the same today as they did last year. But if you're a Russian citizen trying to buy groceries or pay rent, you're not so lucky. Household goods and food prices are skyrocketing, and those increases are much more noticeable. In fact, while official Russian inflation figures sit around 7 to 8%, the real pain is felt in everyday items like food, where price hikes are much more severe. This isn't something most Russians are feeling fully just yet. In fact, many Russians, especially in poorer regions, are actually seeing their wages go up. But don't be fooled by that. It's temporary. Soldiers and recruits are seeing pay raises and bonuses that are far beyond what they'd earn in civilian life, but this is where it gets dangerous for the Kremlin. The bonuses they're offering to soldiers have skyrocketed in the past year. Why? Because that's the only way to get people to sign up. But this is unsustainable. You can't just keep doubling or tripling military wages indefinitely. Eventually, that starts affecting wages in other industries, and the economy spirals. And even if they did stop raising wages, it might trigger mass discontent. If soldiers stop getting these massive bonuses, what happens when they return home to find their rubles don't stretch as far as they used to? This brings us to an interesting tipping point. Russia is stuck in a cycle where it needs to keep spending more and more money to maintain its war effort, but the more they spend, the worse their economy becomes. And we're already starting to see the cracks. Let's talk about another critical factor, Russia's military stockpiles. Much of the equipment they're using today isn't brand new. It's leftover Soviet-era machinery that's been refurbished. That works for now, but those stockpiles are running out. Estimates suggest that about 80% of the equipment Russia is using in Ukraine comes from these old stockpiles. Only 20% is brand new. As those stockpiles dwindle, they'll be forced to produce more brand new equipment, which is far more expensive and time-consuming. What does this mean in practice? Over the next year or so, Russia will face shortages in key military assets, things like tanks, artillery, and infantry vehicles. When the stockpiles run dry, Russia won't be able to refurbish old gear at the same rate, and producing brand new tanks takes a lot more time and money. Sure, they could try to buy equipment from countries like Iran or North Korea, but that's a stopgap solution at best. This brings us to the point that Ukrainian defense intelligence made Russia is on a clock. By 2025, Russia will either have to win this war or face the consequences of an economy that can no longer sustain its military operations. Once those stockpiles run out and inflation spirals, it will be nearly impossible to maintain their current level of military activity. And while Russia faces these growing problems, Ukraine has the backing of Western economies that are frankly far more stable. The West isn't running a wartime economy. We aren't pumping unsustainable amounts of money into military production. If the political will remains strong, Ukraine will continue receiving the support it needs, and Russia will find itself in an even more precarious position. But here's the kicker. The sanctions that many in the West claim aren't working? They are. Yes, Russia has found some ways around them, but those workarounds cost them a lot. Every workaround puts more strain on an already fragile economy. The longer these sanctions are in place, the more pressure mounts on Russia's ability to sustain its wartime spending. So, where does this leave us? The tipping point is coming. Russia's economy can't keep going like this forever. Inflation is rising, stockpiles are depleting, and the Kremlin's options are running thin. The real question isn't whether Russia will reach this breaking point, it's when. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like, share it with others, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell icon to get notified when I upload new content. Also, if you're interested in understanding more about economic dynamics, check out my video titled The U.S. Economy, Explained, Key Facts That Affect You. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.